For this second lecture on the ancient Maya, we will have a shorter lecture. It's a lot more images, and we'll just talk a little bit. And I want to, in particular, emphasize we've focused a lot in the last few class periods on what were the elites doing, what was the life of kings and queens and so forth, and palaces and major buildings. But even during the Mesoamerican Classic period, when you have the rise of great cities and states, most people in Mesoamerica were still farmers. Most people in Mesoamerica still lived in villages, in small grass roof, wattle and daub buildings like you see in the background there. And then if you look in the very distant background of this image, there's a city with stone pyramids. So even as these few urban centers developed, a lot of people would have still lived in the traditional farming lifestyle that had been established at the beginning of the formative period. So in part, we're going to continue to look at classic period architecture from buildings and cities and so forth in this lecture, but I want us to keep in mind the sort of lived experience of ancient Mesoamerica. Now, one of my personal heroes in archaeology in general and in Mesoamerican archaeology in particular is a woman you're going to learn about in the film Cracking the Maya Code, which will show up in your weekly module soon. And that is Tatiana, or Tanya as she was sometimes known, Perskuryakov. Now, Perskuryakov was trained as an architect, and because of that, she had a really keen eye for drawing things in perspective. If you've ever tried to draw a building, you may know that there's a particular trick to it to try to get perspective correct. And she was also really adept at reconstructing what a building must have looked like when it was complete, even if she's found it in kind of a ruined state. And she often incorporated people in her drawings to give some scale and kind of personalize ancient Mesoamerican sites. And then Perskuryakov was also just a very smart person who helped solve a key mystery in the decipherment of the Mesoamerican, or the Mayan in particular, hieroglyphic script. So it's in part thanks to Perskuryakov that some epigraphers can now read Mayan hieroglyphics. So here we have a pencil and watercolor drawing of the site of Piedras Negras, and you can see she's put some people into this drawing for scale. And in a way, these drawings kind of make the sites come to life. And furthermore, just personally, art was one of the things that brought me to archaeology, and so I feel very deeply connected to these beautiful reconstruction drawings from the mid-20th century made by Tatiana Perskuryakov. Here we have a drawing of a really elaborate sort of series of comb features above this arched doorway here at the site of Labna. This reconstruction of Labna, I think, is significant because you can see in the front corner an example of a building wearing a mask. This is a building with a face. This is a building that was alive. And I think that's really significant to help us remember this is an animistic society. Even though they had become urban, to them, even the buildings that they built were living beings, social agents in a way. Looking at reconstructions like here at the site of Sayil, this really kind of speaks to it reminds me of modern civic ceremonial centers in our capital cities. It could be this could be ancient Rome. This could be modern Washington, D.C., but it's not. It's the Maya site of Sayil. Here we have a reconstruction of, I believe this is Temple 1 as opposed to Temple 2, but they look very similar. At Temple 1 at Tikal, and you can see in the reconstruction the massive sort of headdress or comb worn above the preserved temple at the top of this steep staircase. And keep in mind our discussion from earlier in the class about these staircases were steep, they're difficult to climb, they're dangerous. Today, many of them have been barred for tourists climbing them, and instead you've got to go up a modern staircase on a series of scaffolds adjacent to the building. And I think that's significant because the priests who could ascend these stairs were in a way going through a rite of passage. They were climbing a sacred mountain. Here you see the elaborate sort of geometric designs above this long sort of council hall type building at the site of Uxmal. Another reconstruction of Uxmal shows several different kinds of monumental architecture and some people for scale to demonstrate that this is, truly an urban setting. Here we have a reconstruction of Kaaba, and I wish I could see in more detail what that building is in the center, but it appears to be very elaborately decorated. This reconstruction of the site of Washaktun does a great job of showing the site in its natural setting, in its landscape, but also keep in mind that that downtown civic ceremonial core that Proskuryakov has depicted in her drawing is itself lifted up on top of an acropolis of leveled earth. And so it would have been the building of the platform on which the pyramids and temples rest that would have been the really massive investment of human labor. If you have visited Mesoamerican sites on vacation, one of the probable places you may have gone is Chichen Itza. So you can see here at Chichen Itza some of the well-known buildings that are often photographed there, and some people for scale as well. And then, just because she's a personal hero of mine, here I have some pictures of Proskuryakov in the field in the early 20th century. At the time, she was often the only woman working on a large crew with men, but she had such a talent for depicting architectural reconstructions that her input was highly valued by her research colleagues. But what was life like for the majority of the population, the 99% of Mesoamerica, not the kings and queens and sort of highest priests living in the cities? The majority of Mesoamerican populations, from the formative period through the post-classic period, and in some parts of Mesoamerica through today, were living in the countryside. They were agriculturalists. They were living in humble homes. Here you can see some modern examples, and there are parts of Mesoamerica, including in Oaxaca where I work, where people still live in homes like this. You have walls built out of woven sticks, sometimes with mud, or sort of mud and plaster kind of washed over them to keep the wind out. And then you've got a roof made out of grass or palm fronds. These roofs need to be replaced, and what you would do is you'd pull it off and you'd burn it and put new one on about every 20 years. They tend to get full of lots of dust and lizards and so forth. So these are small scale, they're ephemeral, they don't leave a very strong record in the archaeological record, but this appears to have been the way that many people lived throughout the pre-Hispanic period in particular. How did these classic period Mesoamericans produce their food and produce the surplus food that supported the urban centers and their monumental constructions? Well, they did it with different techniques depending on what region they were in and depending on the environmental setting that they had to deal with. So one of the typical ways that this farming was done was slash and burn agriculture. Now, slash and burn has sort of received traditionally kind of a bad name in the West. When I was a kid and we used to watch documentaries on Nat Geo about for example, the Amazon rainforest, slash and burn agriculture was blamed for a lot of deforestation, and there's truth to that. But also, slash and burn agriculture at the small scale, at the village scale or family scale, is not responsible for the destruction of the jungle at nearly the scale as urban sprawl or factory farming or logging industry and so forth. And so if you're doing farming just for your small community with a slash and burn technique, this can be a fairly sustainable way to practice farming. So what you do is you basically cut down the foliage in this part of the jungle, you burn it, and that burning releases the nitrogen from the foliage into the topsoil. It's interesting. In the jungle, the soil is actually pretty poor. It's thin, it's acidic, and the majority of the nutrients in a true jungle is actually stored in the plant life. So if you can release that, especially nitrogen, from the plant life by burning it, it helps to fertilize the soil. Then you go and you dig your rows and you plant your corn, your beans, and your squash and so forth. You grow that for a while until it starts to lose fertility, and then you let it go fallow, which means you let the sort of the jungle absorb it again and take it back over long enough to develop another sort of growth of plants, and then you cut that and burn it and start the cycle over again. So if you have enough land where you can rotate your crops among different fields to let them go fallow kind of one at a time, this can be a relatively sustainable sort of a technological approach to farming. Another style of farming done in lowland areas where there's a lot of water, such as swampy regions or areas near the coast, is raised field agriculture. So unlike irrigation agriculture, this is agriculture in an area where you have too much water. So what do you do? How do you deal with farming in a swamp? Well, one way that you can deal with farming in a swamp is essentially to dig troughs in the muck under the water and then heap that rich, black, smelly mud that you've dug up out of the swamp into these raised fields in the center. And you keep doing that, and you keep doing that until over time you raise this sort of central hillock up above the level of the water. And that's important because most agricultural foods, with a few exceptions, like I think rice is an exception, most agricultural foods need to grow above the water level or their roots tend to rot. So you dig the muck up, you heap up these central mounds or raised fields, and then you practice farming on top of that. Now, in some cases, in ancient Mesoamerica, they took this even further and made really elaborate technologically advanced approaches to farming by doing things like combining this raised field, or what the Aztecs called chinampa agriculture, with the growing of fish in the canals. And then the fish are going to eat, the fish are going to poop, and that fertilizer can actually help make the raised fields. When you scoop it up again and dump it back up on the top, that can actually help fertilize the field itself. When this is combined with multi-cropping, such as growing beans and squash and maize together, it can be even more sustainable. So for example, a plant like maize or corn takes nitrogen out of the soil and needs that nitrogen to grow and to become ripe to feed people. But a plant like beans, beans are actually a nitrogen fixer. So what beans do is beans put nitrogen back into the soil. So now these crops weren't domesticated at the same time, but once they figured it out, once Mesoamericans were using this combination of different crops, they learned to multi-crop, to grow beans and corn together in particular, and also squash later on in all together. And that actually helps to maintain the soil by putting nitrogen in, taking it out, and it can be a pretty sustainable approach to agriculture. We still don't do this today. We tend to monocrop. We tend to need to add artificial fertilizer to our soil because we're always taking the nitrogen out of it. We could learn a thing or two from the pages of ancient Mesoamerica. Another agricultural technique employed by ancient Mesoamericans is the terracing of hillsides. If you live in a small valley, such as the Copan Valley, and your community is expanding, where are you going to farm? You may need to farm increasingly on the hillsides instead of down on the valley floor. Well, in order to keep the topsoil from washing away, one approach is to basically turn the hillside into a series of steps to preserve the topsoil. So how did social organization work for the classic period Maya? Well, the nobility lived in palaces, often near the core of these urban sites. Here you can see the nobility being depicted in carved stone, and look at the scale of this thing. There's a person in the lower left. Look at how large this carved stone is. Now, the nobility didn't just live there for free. They depended on tax and tribute from the citizens of the community. So the rulership legitimated their role by providing special services. We talked about this when we discussed the Sacred Covenant of Mesoamerica. So what services did the nobility provide in exchange for being fed and supported by the commoners? Well, one of the things that they could do is offer auto-sacrifice, to sacrifice of themselves. So this stone carving shows the famous Maya noblewoman, Lady Shock, as she is passing a cotton rope laced with acacia thorns through her own tongue and then letting blood down onto some paper that sits in a bowl. The bowl full of paper is then lit on fire, and from the fire emerges the Vision Serpent, a curling smoke serpentine monster that appears in front of Lady Shock. And from the mouth of the Vision Serpent appears one of her own ancestors with whom she can communicate. I love this imagery. Not only is it beautifully carved, in bas-relief by the way, but also we have here in one image a really sophisticated and nuanced encapsulation of the Mesoamerican social relationships, cosmology, belief about life and death, belief about realms of existence. There's so much encapsulated here. There's so much kind of trapped in this image. I find it very compelling. Here you see another image of Lady Shock and her assistant, I believe also her husband, Shield Jaguar, participating in a ceremony where he's holding a torch so that probably the commoners down below the pyramid, can see what she's doing. And what is she doing? She's letting blood down that rope of acacia thorns from her own tongue so that she can participate in this ritual. Now, Lady Shock was famous for this. Shock and Shield Jaguar moved around the classic Maya period world, participating in this bloodletting ceremony at different sites. In a way, she was kind of like a celebrity. I think it's a little facetious to say she was like a pop star of the classic period because there's a lot of religion tied up in here as well. But she certainly would have been well-known, well-respected, and in fact kind of a sacred figure for the classic period Maya. Sacrifice and bloodletting for the Maya is depicted in other places as well. Here in one of the famous Bonampak murals, you can see people using thorns to pierce their own tongues. They also pierce the septums of their noses, they pierce their ears, in some cases they pierce their genitals, and the nobles do this in order to offer their own sacred blood. Their blood, being nobles, is valuable as a sacrifice to the gods, as part of telling the future, beseeching the powers that be for favor, for good weather, for luck in battle, and that sort of thing. Here you can see again a ruler providing a blood sacrifice to a priest for religious purposes. In another example of Maya, beautiful Maya art, really intricate art and writing of the Maya, you can see ancestor veneration, again with the Vision Serpent, this large, almost kind of Quetzalcoatl style snake character curling across the image, and then it opens its jaws wide, and what comes out? An ancestor, a deceased, a ghost basically comes out of its mouth so that that ancestor can be worshipped, can be asked questions, can somehow be consulted with. Other imagery for the Maya, for the classic Maya, show, examples of human sacrifice on some of those stelae we discussed. Also, in addition to the sacrifice here, check out the really elaborate costumes of the priests themselves, in some cases dressing like jaguars or birds, and wearing really complicated attire that, in a way, kind of puts their social status on their bodies. The classic period Maya believed that the ball game was not just a sport, but was part of their own creation story. Political issues and so forth were worked out on ball courts. They were considered, sort of portals to the underworld. Classic period Maya nobles marched to war, and part of the goal was to capture enemy nobles and then sacrifice them. So there's a lot of intrigue going on. We talked about that with the example of 18 Rabbit being captured and beheaded. Classic period Mesoamericans, including the Maya, decorated their bodies. They practiced body modification. They gauged their ears with huge spools. They probably practiced scarification of their skin. They wore nose plugs. They wore lip plugs. They modified their own teeth. Check out how teeth could be drilled and in some cases sort of sawed or chipped into shape. I've seen some of these myself. In fact, there was so much dental modification going on that there was an archaeologist in the 60s, 70s, and 80s who specialized his whole career. He focused on making a typology of just the different ways in which people modified their teeth. Classic period Mesoamericans decorated their bodies with elaborate art, sometimes made from materials that had to be imported from far away. So you can see this necklace is made of tiny skulls, but the skulls are carved from shells that had to be imported from the coast. During the Classic period in the Maya region, as we've seen for other parts of Mesoamerica, you have beautiful polychrome vases indicating craft specialization, that people are really sort of focused on making vessels in a way that's nicer than necessary just to provide food. Clearly, these elaborate vessels tell stories in addition to just containing a substance. In the Classic period Maya world, writing was common, especially in the urban centers, but it would have been just a small subset of society who could write. The scribes would have been essentially a kind of noble status, and probably a larger but still pretty small group of people who could really understand the script. The majority of the farming population may have recognized some of these symbols, but they wouldn't have been literate in the way that we think of today. Another example of really advanced economic specialization in the Classic period Maya is the making of eccentric flint chipped stone. Now, these are considered some kind of a ritual offering. They're the kinds of chipped stone tools that wouldn't really be useful as a tool, but rather as a symbolic item, as a religious item. And in fact, they're often found in the sacred caches that were used to feed the buildings. Unfortunately, because those caches were often left at the bottom of the staircase of buildings, looters learned where they were, and many of these have been looted. Now, some of these quote-unquote eccentric flints are so masterfully made that they might have 7 human faces emerging from them with elaborate headdresses. I mean, keep in mind, these are chipped out of a single piece of stone. It's hard just to make a projectile point, let alone tell a story in stone the way these eccentric flints do. In fact, there's essentially no one alive today with the skill to make these things, and there's been a question about how they were even made. It appears as though our best evidence suggests that these were made by sort of grand masters of flint knapping who were sort of in charge of these houses of apprentices, and the houses themselves were supported by the nobility. So the nobles would kind of pay for the education and training of an apprentice under the tutelage of a grand master, and you'd essentially spend your life learning how to make one of these things. In fact, it was seeing one of these, unfortunately probably a looted one, at a museum in England that kind of first opened my eyes to Mesoamerica. Here's one of my favorite examples of an eccentric flint. Again, a single piece of stone that's been chipped to show a Maya noble person seated in a boat or a canoe that's also kind of a crocodilian monster that is traveling over the waves of Xibalba, the watery underworld, as the Lord travels down at death, at the moment of death. So this is a true example of a moment in history, actually kind of a story, being captured in this incredibly masterful, detailed flint knapping work. You can also see what appears to be maybe some plaster or some other kind of material that was layered over the stone itself. So the Classic period Maya, some of the things we know about them include their emphasis on the sacred calendar, as well as the solar calendar, their creation story, the Popol Vuh, that I'm going to suggest to you, and these other aspects of really elaborate life of a complex society that we've talked about in these last 2 lectures. Finally, I just want to emphasize that when it comes up in your weekly module, make sure you watch the film Cracking the Maya Code. It does a great job of explaining the way Maya writing worked better than I can in a lecture, and it also personalizes some of the stories of Maya research. It's an excellent film.